Good evening and welcome. Tonight it feels as though we are pausing at a quiet doorway just before entering a very old story. Beyond that doorway is Andromeda, one of the most enduring figures in Greek mythology, a princess remembered for her beauty, her danger, her rescue, and the long afterlife of her tale in art and literature. If you enjoy these slow, gentle journeys, you are welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a quiet comment about where you are listening from tonight, or what myth or ancient story you might want to visit next. But there is no hurry, and no need to do anything at all except settle in. Let the room grow softer around you. Let the noise of the day drift a little farther away. We will move calmly through the myths, the family lines, the sea crossing, the old artworks, and the many details that have gathered around Andromeda over time. And now, with the night around us and the story waiting gently ahead, we can step through that doorway and begin. Andromeda belongs to the royal family of Ethiopia in Greek myth, though ancient writers did not always imagine that kingdom in the same way. In some versions, her father is Cepheus and her mother is Cassiopeia, which places her within a house of status, speech, and consequence. That royal setting matters because the myth is not only about a girl in danger, but about how one family's pride, fear, and decisions draw an entire coast into crisis. The story begins in a court, not on a battlefield, and that gives it a quieter kind of pressure. There are no marching armies at first, only the atmosphere of a household where each word can shape the future. In that sense, Andromeda's myth feels almost ceremonial, as if the danger is already present in the room long before anyone sees it. Her name itself carries a sense of formal dignity. Like many Greek mythic names, it sounds musical in the ear, shaped to be remembered and repeated. Over centuries, Andromeda became more than a character in a rescue tale. She became a symbol of vulnerability, beauty, and the way myth often places women at the center of public danger. Even before the monster appears, the atmosphere around her is already full of tension. She is royal, watched, spoken of, and positioned in a world where private life and public destiny are closely tied. The name also has the kind of balance ancient storytellers loved, a sound that feels measured and complete, almost like it belongs both to poetry and to stone inscriptions. In later imagination, that name would travel far beyond the original tale, but in the myth itself it remains attached to a young woman whose life is being decided by larger forces. The earliest myths about her are not preserved in one single untouched form. Instead, they come from later literary and artistic retellings, especially those that made her story vivid for Greek and Roman audiences. That means Andromeda is both stable and shifting at once. Her basic shape remains the same, while details of place, appearance, and rescue change quietly from author to author. This is common in Greek mythology, where characters live across many retellings rather than one fixed book. A vase painting may show one version, a tragedy another, and a Roman poet yet another. Andromeda's story survives like that in layers. We do not meet her in a perfectly sealed original form. We meet her through centuries of remembering, reshaping, and retelling, which gives her a slightly dreamlike quality, as if she is always approaching from a distance. Cassiopeia, her mother, is often the first cause of the trouble. In the most familiar version, she boasts that her daughter is more beautiful than the sea nymphs. That one boast ripples outward until the sea itself becomes hostile. Greek myth often works this way, letting speech create consequence. A proud sentence can disturb gods, oceans, and kings alike. Andromeda stands in the middle of that disturbance, not because she caused it, but because she must live through it. There is something quietly tragic in that arrangement. A daughter becomes the place where her mother's words are answered. A family becomes the center of a cosmic correction. The myth reflects a broader ancient concern with restraint, with the danger of speaking beyond what the gods or the world will tolerate. And so the sea, in many versions, becomes less like a place and more like an offended presence. The constellation named Andromeda was known to later astronomers and storytellers as a way of carrying her into the sky. but in myth she remains deeply earthly. She is a daughter, a princess, a captive, and a figure of expectation. Her life is shaped by family and by the forces larger than family, and that combination is one reason her story stayed so memorable. The stars preserve her name in a calm, high place, but the original tale is much more immediate. It concerns ropes, rocks, sea air, fear, and waiting. In that contrast between the sky and the shore, between celestial memory and human vulnerability, the myth gains part of its lasting power. Even when later generations look upward and find a constellation, the story still seems to remember the body tied to the earth. In many retellings, the land of Ethiopia is described at the edge of the Greek imagination, a place both known and distant. That distance adds to the feeling of wonder. Andromeda is not a local maiden from a small village tale. She comes from a royal household set at the border of the familiar and the imagined, where the sea seems wide enough to carry divine punishment or divine rescue. Ancient Greek writers often used far-off lands to enlarge the emotional scale of a story. Places at the edge of the world could feel more open to marvels, monsters, and gods. Ethiopia in myth is part geography, part poetic horizon. It is a name that suggests heat, radiance, distance, and prestige all at once. Andromeda belongs to that landscape of margins where the ordinary rules feel less secure. This is part of what makes her myth so lasting. It begins with courtly grace, but it opens into something far older and wilder, the meeting point between human pride and the ancient sea. The shore is a threshold in Greek story, one of those places where human order thins out and greater powers are felt more sharply. A royal daughter, a troubled kingdom, and the sea in anger create a setting that feels both intimate and immense. Andromeda's danger is personal, yet it is also public, because her body becomes the site where a whole community's fate is negotiated. That structure is one reason the myth has remained memorable for so long. It is simple enough to follow, but broad enough to hold grief, beauty, warning, and relief all together. Andromeda's story also shows how Greek myth often gives women a kind of narrative stillness while the world around them moves violently. She is seen, described, judged, and placed. Her role is not to cause the storm, but to endure it. That can make her seem passive on the surface, yet her presence carries the emotional center of the tale. In myths like this, stillness is not emptiness. It is a charged kind of waiting. She becomes the point around which decisions gather, and that makes her image linger in the mind. The sea may roar, the gods may send signs, and men may argue over what to do, but Andromeda remains the figure at the heart of the composition, calm only in the sense that the story has not yet granted her motion. Ancient audiences would likely have recognized the structure of this kind of myth very quickly. A boast is made, an offense follows, a punishment descends, and a daughter is exposed to danger because the household has lost favor. This is not unique to Andromeda. Greek stories often return to the same deep patterns, where excess is corrected through suffering, and where the innocent pay for the imbalance of others. Yet Andromeda's version feels especially vivid because it joins courtly elegance to exposed vulnerability. She is not only a victim of divine anger. She is also a royal image, a daughter in a setting where appearance matters, where lineage matters, and where reputation may be as important as survival. The preservation of her myth through art gives her an additional kind of life. Painters, sculptors, and poets each emphasize different details. Some focused on the moment of rescue, some on the bound figure by the shore, and some on the monster looming in the distance. Because of that, Andromeda can seem to exist in several emotional temperatures at once. She is frighteningly vulnerable in one scene, almost serene in another, and transformed in another still. Later viewers, too, would meet her as a figure both beautiful and solemn, never entirely separated from the tension that defines her. The fact that she appears in so many forms suggests how easily the myth touched the imagination. It is not a complicated tale in the way some epics are, but it leaves room for atmosphere, and atmosphere is often what lingers longest. The sea itself is essential to the feeling of the story. In Greek myth, the sea is never merely water. It is a living boundary, a realm of gods and monsters, storms and omens. When the sea turns against Andromeda's family, it is as though the horizon has become moral. The world is no longer neutral. Waves can answer speech. Depth can respond to pride. This gives the myth a soft but unmistakable grandeur. Even the violence is wrapped in ritual feeling, as if the elements are taking part in a judgment older than any human court. Andromeda stands beside that water as a figure of exposed innocence, framed by salt air and waiting silence. Her story also reflects the ancient fascination with lineage. Greek myths often make family history inseparable from fate. A parent's act, a grandparent's curse, or a divine relationship can pass through generations like weather. Andromeda is born into that system. She does not choose the conditions of her story, she inherits them. That inherited structure is part of why the myth can feel so melancholy. The disaster is not random. It arrives through ancestry, through speech, through the fragile honor of a household. Ancient myth repeatedly asks what kind of burdens are carried by children who did not make the mistakes of their elders. In Andromeda's case, that question becomes a seaside tableau of fear, beauty, and waiting. Even the uncertainty around the old sources adds to her charm. Because her tale is not rooted in a single authoritative account, she remains open to interpretation. Some tellings emphasize divine punishment, others the monster, and others the eventual rescue. Some expand the role of her parents, while others keep the focus tightly on Andromeda herself. This flexibility is one reason the story has lived so comfortably in the imagination. It can be told as tragedy, romance, warning, or wonder. Yet in every version, there is the same basic emotional shape: a young woman placed in danger by forces larger than herself, and a world that seems to pause around her. What stays most vivid, perhaps, is the contrast between her royal origin and her exposed fate. Andromeda is a princess, but the title does not protect her when the sea demands an answer. Greek myth often delights in that contrast, bringing high status low to the edge of helplessness. In doing so, it reminds listeners that rank can be fragile, and that beauty can attract attention without offering safety. Andromeda's myth is therefore not only a story about rescue, it is also a story about the limits of privilege, the instability of praise, and the way public admiration can become peril when it is joined to pride. For later readers, the myth carries a gentle kind of sorrow. It is easy to remember the monster and the rescue, but the deeper feeling lies in the long moment before either of those things arrive. Andromeda's world is already wounded by the time she is brought to the shore. The court has spoken, the sea has answered, and she is left to wait in the space between human error and divine resolution. That suspended atmosphere is part of what makes the story so enduring. It is not only dramatic, it is hushed. It holds a kind of stillness that allows the imagination to settle, even as the ancient sea remains in motion just beyond the edge of the frame. When ancient storytellers spoke of Andromeda, they were usually speaking about danger that arrived in the language of ritual and consequence. Her father, Cepheus, was a king, and her mother, Cassiopeia, was a queen, but their power did not protect the household from divine attention. In the older Greek imagination, royal families often stood close to the edge of the sacred world, where a single boast or mistake could awaken a god's anger. Andromeda's story begins in that space. She is not introduced as an adventurer or a warrior or even a woman making a choice. She is first framed as a daughter within a court that has upset the balance of pride and humility, and from that imbalance comes a punishment that feels strangely vast, as if the whole shoreline must bear witness. That shoreline matters. The setting of Andromeda's myth is usually Ethiopia, though the ancient Greeks may not have imagined the same geography we would use today. Their Ethiopia was often a distant southern land, a place at the edges of the known world, coloured by wonder and remoteness. In some versions, the kingdom stands beside the sea, and the sea is not a quiet backdrop but an active force, broad and heavy, holding the threat that the monster will emerge from it. The myth seems to love the contrast between a palace made by human hands and the open water beyond it, as if civilization itself were only a fragile arrangement along the coast. Andromeda becomes a figure caught between those worlds, between human order and the deep, unknowable powers of nature and the gods. The punishment that falls on her family begins with Cassiopeia's famous claim that she was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs. Ancient stories often treat beauty as something powerful enough to become dangerous. It is not merely a pleasant quality, it can disturb divine hierarchies. The Nereids associated with the sea and with Poseidon's domain are insulted, and Poseidon responds by sending a monstrous flood or sea beast to ravage the land. Scholars have long noticed that this is a very old kind of mythic logic, in which excess speech invites cosmic correction. Andromeda herself does not boast. She does not speak the offending words, yet the myth places her in the line of consequence anyway, which gives the whole tale a quiet sadness. She is paying for the loudness of others. From there, the most haunting image in the story arrives: Andromeda chained to a rock. Ancient artists loved this moment, perhaps because it is so stark and easy to recognize. A young woman, the sea behind her, the sky above, and around her the terrible stillness of being offered up to danger. In some tellings she is naked or nearly so, in others clothed, but the essential image remains one of exposure. She is displayed not as a criminal, but as a sacrifice. The rock becomes a kind of altar. The sea breeze, the salt air, the sound of waves striking stone, all of it gives the scene a severe and almost ceremonial atmosphere. This is one of the reasons the myth has lasted so long. It turns helplessness into an image so clear that it seems almost carved from light. Yet even in this bleak setting, the story leaves room for the unexpected arrival of rescue. Perseus sees Andromeda and falls in love, though different authors explain his reaction in different ways. Sometimes he is simply struck by her beauty. Sometimes he is moved by compassion first, desire second. Sometimes the moment becomes more complicated because Perseus has just come from his own extraordinary adventure with Medusa, carrying the frightening proof of victory. He asks for Andromeda's hand in marriage if he defeats the monster, and her parents agree. In this exchange, love and negotiation are tightly bound together, as they often are in myth. Andromeda's future is decided while she is still standing in chains, which gives the scene a tense, almost ceremonial quality, as though her life is being transferred from one fate to another by means of an oath. The monster itself is described differently across ancient sources, and that uncertainty is part of the story's enduring texture. Sometimes it is a sea serpent, sometimes a great beast sent by Poseidon, sometimes a more general calamity given the shape of a creature. Ancient authors were not always interested in zoological precision. They were interested in the feeling of terror and in the symbolic role the monster plays. It is a force of ruin, a living embodiment of the sea's punishment. Perseus kills it in some versions with the sword he carries, in others with the newly won power of Medusa's head. That head, which can turn living things to stone, creates another layer of mythic resonance. The rescue is not clean and simple. It is the result of one miracle making possible another. The whole episode feels stacked with divine leftovers, a sequence of strange gifts and dangers passed from one episode to the next. There is also a darker edge to the rescue, because Andromeda's story does not end with being saved. In many versions, a conflict follows at the wedding feast when another suitor, Phineus, contests Perseus's claim. The room becomes tense, then violent, and Perseus again uses Medusa's head to end the dispute. The party of marriage and the place of danger collapse into one another. Ancient myth often refuses to keep celebrations separate from bloodshed. A wedding can become a battlefield in a few breaths. Andromeda, who has already been bound to a rock as an offering, now stands at the center of another contest over her life and loyalty. She remains less a speaker than a prize in the eyes of others, and that silence is one of the myth's most persistent and unsettling qualities. At the same time, The ancient tradition also preserves Andromeda's own agency more quietly than the most famous scenes suggest. Later writers and dramatists sometimes emphasize her dignity, her calm acceptance, or even her courage. She is not always merely passive. Being bound to a rock does not mean she is reduced to nothing. Rather, it can heighten her moral presence. In visual art, especially on pottery and mosaics, she often appears composed even in despair. The Greeks admired restraint, and Andromeda's stillness may have made her seem noble in the face of terrible injustice. That composure has probably helped her endure in the imagination over centuries. She becomes the figure who does not break, even while waiting for destruction to arrive from the sea. Her myth also has a deeply astronomical afterlife. Andromeda is now a constellation, and this transformation is one of the clearest signs that the ancient world loved to lift stories into the sky. The stars preserve memory by turning it into pattern. Alongside Andromeda are Cepheus, Cassiopeia, Perseus, and even Cetus, the sea monster in the broader celestial family of myths. Different cultures and different ages saw different shapes in the stars, but for the Greeks, the sky was a kind of archive of narrative. Andromeda's place among the constellations is fitting because her story is one of exposure and visibility. She was made public in her suffering, and then in the heavens she became visible still, though now in a more distant and serene form. The stars repeat the old story without sound. The constellation itself reminds us that Andromeda was not only a character in myth, but a point of orientation for ancient observers. The sky was used for navigation, seasonal timing, and storytelling all at once. People could look up and find a royal family arranged across the darkness, as if myth had become architecture. In that arrangement, Andromeda is one of the few figures whose story centers on a woman rather than a god, hero, or monster. She is one of the human points around which the celestial design turns. This is perhaps why artists and poets continue to return to her. She offers a narrative of vulnerability, rescue, and transformation that is both intimate and cosmic. She is a mortal woman made part of the heavens, but only after the sea has threatened to erase her. There is also a rich tradition of interpreting Andromeda as a symbol of innocence threatened by public error. That interpretation is not always explicit in ancient sources, but it lingers in the way the myth unfolds. Her parents' actions create disaster, and she is the one placed in the path of its resolution. This pattern appears often in Greek myth, where family guilt can flow forward into the next generation. It reflects a worldview in which households are bound together by honor and pollution, blessing and curse. Andromeda's suffering is therefore not random. It is woven into a broader ancient sense that one person's speech, pride, or neglect can alter the fate of many. The myth is beautiful, but it is not gentle. It teaches that the social and divine worlds are never fully separate. And still, the ending is not entirely tragic. Perseus rescues Andromeda, marries her, and together they become ancestors in other myths, especially those connected with the line of Heracles. In that sense, Andromeda's story enters the genealogical fabric of Greek heroic history. She is not only the girl on the rock. She becomes a mother, a queen, and part of a lineage that continues into later legends. Ancient myth often measured significance through descent, and Andromeda's importance grows when we see how many later stories pass through her family line. The rescue is not simply the end of one scene, it opens into a future of royal ancestry, heroic kinship, and remembered origins. The woman who was almost given to the sea becomes instead a source of continuation. As the story traveled through the centuries, each retelling softened some details and sharpened others. Poets favored the drama of the rescue. Painters loved the shape of the chained figure and the wings of Perseus. Astronomers looked for her in the sky. Playwrights found in her story a mixture of suspense and spectacle. Yet underneath all these variations remains the same quiet center, a young woman isolated against the shore while forces much larger than herself gather around her. That image has an almost timeless stillness. It can feel like the end of the day, when the sea darkens and the horizon disappears, and only the outline of the cliff remains. Andromeda's story also survives because it holds together opposites that myth rarely keeps apart for long. It is both violent and graceful. It is both a family story and a cosmic story. It is both an account of rescue and an account of sacrifice. Ancient readers and listeners could find in it fear, beauty, injustice, marriage, destiny, and transformation, all layered together like waves reaching the same shore. The myth does not insist on one simple meaning. It seems instead to drift like sea mist between meanings. That softness of interpretation may be part of its allure. Even now, when the tale is retold, it feels ancient in the best sense, as though it belongs to a world where the sky, the sea, and human longing were all speaking at once. And then there is the name itself, Andromeda, which has carried through centuries with remarkable calm. The sound of it is clear and balanced, and in later times it became one of the most familiar names from Greek myth because it joined story to sky so completely. The name outlasted the specific local traditions that may once have surrounded her. We know her through poets like Ovid and through earlier mythographers, but those texts may preserve only fragments of much older oral versions now lost. That uncertainty is part of her presence too. Andromeda comes to us through layers of retelling, never quite fixed, always a little distant, like a figure seen from a shore at dusk. She remains visible, but softly, as if the world itself were asking us to look without disturbing the quiet. Andromeda's story begins, in many tellings, not with her own voice, but with the voices of others describing her, as if she were part of a warning, a payment, or a divine arrangement. In the older Greek imagination, she is often placed at the meeting point between human vulnerability and cosmic scale, and that is one reason her myth has remained so vivid. She belongs to the royal house of Ethiopia in the classical tradition, though the exact geography is not meant to be read like a modern map. Ancient authors sometimes located these far-off kingdoms at the edge of the world, where the familiar coastlines faded into legend and the sea seemed to widen into mystery. That distance mattered. Andromeda was not simply a princess in a palace. She was set in a landscape that already felt remote, almost suspended between civilization and the unknown, which makes her later ordeal feel even more stark and lonely. Her parents, Cepheus and Cassiopeia, are central to the myth, and their names are often preserved alongside hers because the story is deeply family-shaped. Cassiopeia, in particular, is remembered for her boast that her beauty surpassed that of the Nereids, the sea nymphs associated with Poseidon's realm. In Greek myth, such boasting is never merely vanity. It is a dangerous crossing of boundaries, a kind of overbright claim that invites reaction from the divine world. Yet the old stories do not treat this as a simple moral lesson. They have a harsher, more complicated texture. A parent's pride becomes a public disaster, and the consequences fall not in abstract terms, but upon a daughter who is bound, exposed, and made to bear the visual weight of a city's guilt. The myth keeps returning to this unsettling pattern, a family error answered by a child's suffering. That imbalance is one of the reasons the story lingers so long in the mind. When ancient storytellers describe the punishment that follows Cassiopeia's boast, they often speak of a sea monster sent by Poseidon to ravage the coast. The creature, sometimes called Cetus, is not always portrayed in the same way. In some accounts it is more like a great serpent or whale-like beast. In others it has the broad menace of a marine monster that belongs to the realm of chaos itself. The exact form shifts from author to author, which is typical of Greek myth, where creatures often remain partly fluid, as if imagination itself were still shaping them. What matters is the atmosphere of dread. The monster is not just an enemy to be slain. It is a visible manifestation of disorder, a threat rising from the sea that disrupts the boundary between land and water, safety and exposure, order and ruin. And Andromeda stands at the center of that disturbance, not as the cause, but as the one placed in the path of its consequences. It is in this space of danger that one of the most famous images in Greek myth appears: Andromeda chained to a rock, offered to the sea monster as a sacrifice. This scene has echoed through art for centuries, from vase paintings to Renaissance canvases, because it condenses so much into a single still moment. There is the helplessness of the body, the cruelty of the logic that says a girl's life can appease divine anger, and the terrible silence before rescue or death. In some versions she is tied near the shore, in others on a cliff where the spray reaches upward. The scene can feel almost theatrical, but it also carries an ancient sacrificial seriousness. Greek myth often placed women in perilous transitional spaces, and Andromeda, suspended between rock and sea, becomes a powerful image of that in-between state. She is neither safely on land nor yet claimed by the deep. She waits, and waiting itself becomes part of the torment. There is also something notable about the name Andromeda, which many readers have understood as meaning something like ruler of men, or she who has mastery over men, though the exact etymology can be uncertain and debated in scholarly circles. That tension between the grandeur of the name and the helplessness of the mythic situation is striking. The name sounds strong, almost commanding, yet the story places her in a position of captivity and vulnerability. This contrast may not be accidental. Ancient myths often preserve layers of meaning that do not fully agree with one another. A name can carry an older dignity while the narrative around it reveals loss, danger, or transformation. Andromeda's identity, then, is not confined to the chained maiden at the shore. Even before rescue enters the tale, her name suggests a latent nobility, something larger than the immediate scene of fear. The story seems to remember her power even while the plot temporarily removes it. Her rescue is the part of the myth that many people know best, and it is one of the great arrival moments of Greek storytelling. Perseus, returning from his journey with Medusa's head, sees Andromeda and falls in love with her. The combination of romance and danger is characteristic of heroic myth, where affection often begins in the presence of catastrophe. Some versions emphasize that Perseus sees her beauty immediately, others give more space to her suffering and the urgency of the situation. The rescue is not just an act of heroism, but also a negotiation. Perseus asks for her hand in marriage before fighting the monster in some traditions, while in others the promise comes afterward. These variations remind us that myths were told and retold in many local forms. The core remains: a stranger arrives at the edge of disaster, and by force, speed, or divine favor, the doomed scene changes direction. The visual contrast between the chained princess and the winged hero is among the most enduring in Western art. That rescue, however, does not close the story neatly, and the ancient tradition is not always gentle about what comes next. In some versions, Perseus must defeat other suitors or hostile relatives who object to the marriage, and the tale briefly shifts from monster slaying to courtly conflict. This is another example of how Greek myth often layers one kind of danger atop another. The sea monster is external, but human jealousy and political rivalry are just as threatening. After the marriage, Andromeda moves into a new domestic and mythic role, becoming wife to Perseus and mother to a line of descendants that various ancient genealogies take great interest in. Through her children, she enters a broader heroic network that includes the Perseids and, in later legendary structures, the ancestry of Heracles. So while the famous image of her rescue can make the story feel singular, the myth itself continues outward into generations, linking a moment of rescue to dynastic memory and long family histories that ancient audiences value deeply. Andromeda's later life is less commonly discussed, yet it is important because it shows that she does not remain only a rescued maiden frozen in the instant of danger. In certain traditions, she travels with Perseus, leaving her homeland and entering new regions associated with his wanderings. This movement from one place to another can be read as part of a common mythical pattern, in which marriage becomes a transfer between worlds. The woman leaves the place of her father and enters the household of the husband, but in myth this is often made grander, as if whole realms were being bridged. Some versions place her in Argos, others connect her with other parts of Greece, and later folklore sometimes treats her as a figure of astral placement as well as mortal ancestry. She becomes not only a person in a story, but also a node in a larger map of mythic memory, a presence whose life radiates outward into family, geography, and sky. The sky, in fact, offers one of the most enduring afterlives of Andromeda's myth. She became a constellation, and so did other figures tied to her story, including Cepheus, Cassiopeia, Perseus, and even the sea monster in some traditions. This is one of those beautiful ancient habits of thought, in which narrative is lifted into astronomy and the heavens become a kind of memory palace. To look upward at the constellation Andromeda was not simply to observe stars. It was to remember a princess, a rescue, a family disgrace, and the ancient habit of translating earthly drama into celestial form. The night sky preserved what the story had done to her, but in a softened way, as if the anguish had been transformed into pattern. Ancient people often saw the heavens as a record of events both divine and human, and Andromeda's place among the stars gave her a second life beyond the shore where she had once waited in fear. There is also a quiet complexity in the way different ancient authors handled her myth. The story appears in various forms in works by Apollodorus, Ovid, Hyginus, and other writers, each emphasizing different details, as though no single version could contain all of Andromeda's meanings. Some preserve the local Ethiopian setting more strongly, while others shape the tale to fit Roman literary tastes. Ovid, for example, is especially attentive to the visual drama, to the body under threat, to the movement from fear to admiration. Earlier Greek traditions may have been more compact, more concerned with genealogy and divine causation. Scholars have long noted that myths like this are not fixed texts but living structures, changing as they pass through oral tradition, regional memory, and literary reshaping. Andromeda's story survives precisely because it can absorb these changes. It is simple enough to be remembered, yet deep enough to hold many moods: shame, sacrifice, rescue, marriage, lineage, and sky. What is sometimes overlooked is how much the myth depends on the presence of witnesses. Andromeda is not only seen by Perseus, she is seen by the people of her kingdom, by the sea that threatens them, by the gods who have allowed the punishment, and later by generations of readers and artists. The gaze in the myth is complicated. Cassiopeia's boast is an act of looking and comparing. Andromeda's exposure is a punishment that turns her into an object of terrible visibility. Perseus's first sight of her becomes a turning point in the story, and the audience in every retelling is invited to look again. This makes the myth feel unusually self-aware about beauty and vulnerability. It asks what it means to be seen at the edge of life, and what it means when that sight becomes both salvation and possession. In some interpretations, Andromeda's rescue is also a transfer of the gaze, from one kind of ownership to another, from the sea's claim to the hero's claim, from public catastrophe to marital future. That layered complexity is part of why the story remains alive. Andromeda's image also changed with the visual arts, where she could be portrayed as passive, dignified, frightened, or almost serene, depending on the sensibility of the artist and the period. Ancient vase painters, Hellenistic sculptors, Roman mosaics, and later European painters each found something different in her. Sometimes she is shown looking upward, sometimes downward, sometimes with a body stiffened by fear, sometimes with a softness that suggests resignation or hope. These shifting portrayals tell us as much about the artists and their cultures as they do about the myth itself. A chained Andromeda can become a study in helplessness, but she can also become a figure of poised endurance. In later centuries, painters were fascinated by the contrast between exposed skin, dark rock, bright water, and heroic motion. Yet beneath the artistic flourish, the core image remains the same: a person held in an unbearable pause while fate approaches from the sea. Finally, the endurance of Andromeda's myth may lie in how intimately it understands the uneven distribution of suffering. She is one of those figures who reveals how often stories of heroism begin with someone else's helplessness. Her fame is inseparable from the fact that she was nearly lost, yet the myth also grants her a strange immortality. She is remembered not because she conquered the monster herself, but because the ancient world found her plight worth preserving, retelling, painting, and raising into the stars. That does not erase the sadness of the story, but it gives it a lasting shape. Andromeda remains at the edge of the shore and the edge of the sky, a figure of waiting, rescue, and transformation. In the long sleep of myth, she is still there, bound in the imagination of the world, while the sea moves quietly below her and the constellations keep their ancient, patient light. In the older tellings of Andromeda's story, what lingers most strongly is not simply the danger she faces, but the strange stillness around her. She is often shown as a figure placed apart from the noise of the world, fixed against a cliff or a shoreline, waiting in a silence that feels almost ceremonial. This is one reason her image became so powerful in Greek myth. She is not only a princess in peril, she becomes a kind of threshold figure, standing between land and sea, between life and death, between the human order of her family and the vast, uncaring realm of nature. Ancient audiences would have recognized how unsettling that boundary could feel. The sea in Greek thought was never merely a setting. It was a force with moods, limits, and tempers of its own. To be left beside it was to be left near uncertainty itself. Andromeda's isolation, then, is not just emotional. It is cosmological. She seems suspended in a world where human pleading, royal status, and even innocence offer little protection against the demands of divine or monstrous power. The way Andromeda is bound in many artistic versions also matters, because the image has a long and curious history. Greek vase painters, Roman sculptors, and later artists often treated the chains or restraints not simply as details of the rescue narrative, but as signs of vulnerability made visible. Her wrists, her posture, and sometimes the angle of her body all communicate helplessness before a fate she did not choose. Yet there is something refined and almost sculptural in the way she is depicted. The violence of her situation is softened by composure. She does not always appear thrashing or dramatic. Instead, she often stands in a kind of sorrowful stillness, her body elegant even in danger. That contrast is part of why the myth endured so widely. It invites the viewer to feel pity, but also to linger on the beauty of fragility. In some later interpretations, the chains themselves become ambiguous symbols, signs of punishment, yes, but also marks of a story in which restraint precedes transformation. Andromeda is bound in one form so that she may emerge into another. Her rescue by Perseus is usually the turning point everyone remembers, but the encounter also reveals much about ancient ideas of heroism. Perseus does not arrive as a pure champion acting from abstract moral duty. He is traveling, returning, negotiating, and carrying with him the severed head of Medusa, a deadly object whose power still saturates the scene. In some versions, the story becomes almost theatrical. Perseus sees Andromeda, inquires about the cause of her suffering, learns of the sacrifice, and then offers to save her in exchange for marriage. To modern ears, that bargain can feel startlingly abrupt, but in mythic terms it reflects a world in which rescue, alliance, and desire are often interwoven. The hero's arrival is not just a private romantic event. It is an intervention in the political and divine disorder that has trapped the princess. Perseus brings not only strength, but a new axis of possibility. With him enters the chance that a family, a kingdom, and a cursed narrative can all be redirected at once. The monster sent against Andromeda, often called Cetus, has a strangely flexible identity in the mythic tradition. In some retellings, it is imagined as a sea beast of immense scale, a creature with jaws, hide, and the rough mass of a living storm. In others, it is less important as a specific beast, than as a representative of the sea's destructive appetite. Ancient writers did not always agree on what kind of animal it was. Some later cultures pictured it with a whale-like body, while others emphasized something closer to a dragon or serpent of the deep. That uncertainty is part of the myth's atmosphere. The creature is not important because it is zoologically exact. It matters because it embodies a fear that cannot be neatly named. For people living along the Mediterranean, the sea could bring trade, travel, and livelihood, but it could also bring shipwreck, hunger, and loss. The monster waiting for Andromeda is a narrative shape for that anxiety. It is the hunger of the unknown made visible, and the girl chained on the shore becomes the fragile human answer to it. There is also a quiet, often overlooked dimension to the myth in the role of Andromeda's mother, Cassiopeia. Ancient sources differ in how directly they treat her vanity and its consequences, but in many tellings her boast that she or her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids sets the whole tragedy in motion. This detail reflects a recurring moral pattern in Greek myth. Excess pride, especially in matters of beauty and status, invites divine correction. Yet the punishment falls unevenly. The mother's offense results in the daughter's suffering, and that imbalance is what makes the story so haunting. Greek myths often show that the household is not a sealed moral unit. One member's speech can radiate outward and wound the others. Cassiopeia's role, therefore, brings a domestic tragedy into contact with cosmic justice. Her vanity is not merely personal foolishness, it becomes a disturbance in the delicate relations among mortals, sea nymphs and gods. Andromeda, caught in the middle, seems to bear the cost of a claim she never made. This pattern would have felt familiar to ancient audiences, for whom family, honor, and divine favor were all tightly bound together. When Andromeda later becomes part of the heavens in the constellation traditions, the myth shifts into a more lasting and tranquil register. Unlike many heroic figures whose stories end in death or return to ordinary obscurity, she is fixed in the sky. The stars preserve her name, and in that sense the myth grants her an endurance more secure than earthly rescue could offer. Yet the constellations do not entirely erase the sorrow of her story. They translate it. Astronomers and storytellers over time connected her with a pattern of stars visible in the northern sky, where she appears alongside Perseus, Cassiopeia, and Cepheus. Together they form a family map of memory. To look up at them is to see a myth distributed across darkness, each figure suspended in relation to the others. There is something deeply Greek in this transformation. The heavens are not empty. They are orderly, but they still preserve human drama. Andromeda's place among the stars means that her endurance is also her quiet captivity. She is immortalized in a position once chosen by fate, now held forever in light. The starry afterlife of Andromeda's story has also made her one of the most visually connected figures in the mythological sky. Unlike heroes whose constellations feel isolated, Andromeda is part of a whole family arrangement, placed near the image of her mother and father, and near the scene of Perseus. This clustering matters because it turns the sky into a kind of eternal narrative board. The figures are not merely decorative, they are relational. Ancient and medieval skywatchers could imagine the myth spread across the heavens, as though the family had been translated into an arrangement of fixed lamps. Some versions of the star lore differ in the exact identification of the stars, and not every source agrees on the boundaries of the constellation. But the broader idea remains steady. Andromeda is lifted from the shoreline into the cosmos, where her suffering becomes legible through pattern and distance. The act of looking upward thus becomes a form of remembering. One does not just see stars, one sees a story that has been smoothed by time into a shape of permanence. The myth also reveals much about the Greek imagination of marriage, especially because Perseus asks for Andromeda's hand at the very moment he rescues her. This detail can seem abrupt, but it reflects an older world in which marriage was often understood less as private romance and more as a transfer of alliances, protection, and household continuity. Andromeda's rescue does not simply save a life, It also reorders kinship. The princess moves from one family structure into another, and the myth presents that transition as part of the hero's reward. In some tellings, the immediate celebration is interrupted by conflict because another suitor or relative objects to Perseus's claim. That tension highlights the social seriousness of the marriage proposal. It is not a gentle epilogue. It is a contested event, one that can lead to violence. The story therefore keeps reminding us that in myth, love and ownership are often close companions. Andromeda herself remains somewhat quiet in these scenes, which makes her all the more striking. She is acted upon, promised, exchanged, and honored, while the narrative moves around her like a tide around a stone. The later literary tradition often emphasizes Perseus's triumph, but Andromeda's own role as a speaking character is more limited and therefore more intriguing. In some sources she speaks little, in others her words are only briefly recorded. That scarcity can make her seem distant, but it also leaves room for interpretation. Ancient myths were not always interested in giving every figure equal interiority. Instead, they often use silence as a narrative device. Andromeda's quiet may signal helplessness, yet it can also reflect the compressed dignity of a figure whose suffering is already visible enough. Her body, her setting, and her awaiting all speak on her behalf. To a modern reader, this absence of extended speech can feel like an omission, but in the logic of the myth it adds to her aura. She becomes a character whose meaning is partly generated by what others say about her. Her fate is narrated by kings, heroes, and poets, and that layered storytelling gradually turns her into an emblem rather than just a person in a plot. She is remembered not through a long monologue, but through the accumulating gaze of tradition. One of the most charming features of the Andromeda myth is how often it travels beyond literature into the visual and astronomical arts. Her figure appears in mosaics, frescoes, vase painting, and later European canvases, where artists experimented with how to represent both vulnerability and grace. In some works, the shoreline is bright and open, with pale stone, calm surf, and distant mountains. In others, the atmosphere is darker, and the sea looms like a backdrop of blue-black silk. Different eras emphasized different parts of the story. Some focused on the monster, some on the rescue, and some on the poetic stillness of the chained princess. This artistic variety shows how durable the myth was. It could be solemn, dramatic, or almost tender. It could be narrated as terror, but also as a moment of poised expectation. The repeated image of Andromeda tied beside the sea invited viewers to contemplate the contrast between helplessness and celestial destiny. Even when artists did not show the entire myth, a single glance at the figure could evoke the whole story: warning, sacrifice, rescue, and transformation. And finally, Andromeda's enduring presence in Greek mythology may owe something to the way her story holds together so many different emotional tones at once. There is fear, of course, and pity, and the threat of a monstrous end. But there is also courtship, spectacle, divine ancestry, and the eventual promise of heavenly placement. The myth is not purely tragic, and it is not purely romantic. It has the texture of a tale that has been retold many times, each retelling adding another layer of emphasis. One generation may have seen in it a cautionary example about vanity and divine punishment. Another may have read it as a heroic rescue. Still, another may have loved it for the image of the sea-facing princess under a sky of fixed stars. That versatility is perhaps the deepest reason the story survived. Andromeda is at once singular and adaptable, a figure of sorrow who never disappears into sorrow alone. She remains visible, as if lit from within by the many centuries that continue to speak her name, and in that lingering light the old myth settles into a quieter, more spacious kind of memory. In many versions of her story, Andromeda's suffering begins with a kind of cosmic insult. Her mother Cassiopeia boasts that her beauty is greater than that of the sea nymphs. It is a small moment in the myth, but it has the slow, dangerous weight of a ceremonial mistake. In Greek imagination, words were never only words. A boast could ripple outward, through the divine world, through weather, through the sea itself. Cassiopeia's pride is often described as the cause of the disaster, yet the exact shape of the offense changes from one telling to another. Sometimes it is a careless claim spoken in a palace. Sometimes it is a courtly comparison made before the gods. The essential point remains the same. Andromeda becomes the one who must endure the consequences of another person's excess. That pattern gives the myth a strangely modern ache. The young woman is not punished for her own behavior, but for being attached to a household in which vanity has become fate. Ancient audiences would have recognized this as a lesson about balance, measure, and the frightening reach of divine attention. Andromeda's story is therefore not only a rescue tale, but also a tale about how one shimmering act of pride can darken an entire coastline. The land where Andromeda is threatened is usually identified with Ethiopia, though the Greek idea of Ethiopia is not the same as the modern nation. In ancient texts, the name could refer broadly to lands at the edge of the known world, places imagined as remote, sunlit, and full of marvel. This geographical vagueness is part of what gives the myth its atmosphere. Andromeda is a princess, but she is also placed at the border of civilization, where sea and sky seem larger, more powerful, and harder to read. Some ancient writers associate her story with Joppa, on the coast of the Levant, where later travelers claim to see the very rocks to which she was chained. Other traditions keep the setting more mythic and less exact, as if the story belongs not to one map, but to the imaginative margins of the ancient Mediterranean. That uncertainty is useful, because it allows the story to feel both specific and dreamlike. Andromeda stands in a place that is at once royal and exposed, a kingdom's edge where the sounds of the waves become part of the drama. The monster sent to punish her family is called Cetus in many sources, though not always described in the same way. Sometimes it is a sea beast, sometimes a whale-like creature, sometimes a thing so enormous and strange that it resists clear shape. Ancient art and poetry do not always agree on what the monster should look like, and perhaps that is part of the point. Cetus is less a zoological creature than an embodiment of uncontrolled sea power. The ancients knew the sea as a place of trade and travel, but also as a place that could swallow ships without warning. In that sense, the monster does not need to be carefully drawn. It only needs to be immense, wet, hungry, and near. The fact that Andromeda is offered to the monster as a sacrifice makes the shoreline feel especially tragic. The sea is no longer merely a boundary or route. It has become a sentient threat, a force demanding payment. In some versions, the monster was sent by Poseidon himself, in others by another offended deity, and in still others it seems to arise as the natural instrument of a divine curse. The uncertainty deepens the sense that Andromeda lives under sky, where the exact source of suffering is less important than its terrible reality. Andromeda's confinement is one of the most haunting images in Greek myth. She is fastened to a rock, often described as standing near the sea so that the waves can reach her feet, or at least glimmer close below her. The visual power of the scene is almost immediate. A young woman dressed for royalty, stripped of movement, placed against the pale stone and the constant motion of water. In later art, she is sometimes shown half-covered, in the delicate vulnerability familiar from classical sculpture, but the myth itself is less about erotic display than about exposure. She is made visible in the worst possible way, singled out and immobilized in public view. Ancient storytellers may have lingered on the contrast between her stillness and the restless sea. A chained figure on a cliff has a special kind of silence around her, as though the whole shore is listening. Even the wind seems to participate. This image would have resonated strongly in a culture that understood petrification, binding, and sacrifice as signs of helplessness before powers greater than human design. Andromeda becomes a figure of suspended time, waiting in a space where rescue and destruction are equally possible. The decision to sacrifice Andromeda is one of the most unsettling parts of the myth, because it turns a family crisis into a ritual solution. Her parents, or the people responsible for the kingdom, are often presented as desperate to save their land. The oracle has declared that only by giving Andromeda to the monster can the disaster end. Ancient Greek stories are full of such grim exchanges, in which human life is weighed against communal survival. To modern readers, this can feel almost unbearable, but within the mythic world, it reflects the terrifying logic of divine appeasement. A city may endure famine, plague, or storm until a suitable offering is made. The terrible intimacy of this logic lies in the fact that the victim is not a distant criminal, but a daughter, a royal child, a person beloved by those who abandon her. The myth does not always dwell on the parents in a conflict, but one can imagine the ceremonial stillness, the public grief, the attempt to make necessity sound noble. This is one reason Andromeda remains so memorable. She is not merely threatened by a monster. She is placed there by a human community convinced that there is no better answer. The horror is social as much as supernatural. Then comes Perseus, arriving through the air with the speed and uncertainty of a dream. In some retellings, he is returning from his exploit against Medusa. In others, he is simply a wandering hero passing above the coast. His arrival is often described with a suddenness that changes the rhythm of the whole myth. Before he appears, everything is tense, static, and waiting. Once he lands or hovers nearby, the scene becomes a meeting of different kinds of power: royal helplessness, monster force, and heroic mobility. Perseus sees Andromeda and is immediately struck by her beauty, though ancient sources differ in how much emphasis they place on love at first sight. Some say he is seized by desire. Others suggest admiration, sympathy, and heroic duty all arrive together. This ambiguity is useful because it prevents the scene from becoming too simple. A rescue can be tender and opportunistic at once. Perseus asks for her hand in marriage if he can save her, and in most versions her parents agree. The bargain is practical, perhaps even transactional, but within the mythic framework it also gives structure to what follows. A marriage promise hangs in the air while the monster approaches. In this suspended moment, destiny feels as though it is breathing quietly. The battle with Cetus is usually brief in the surviving versions, but its brevity should not be mistaken for simplicity. Perseus has already accomplished something extraordinary with Medusa, and so the myth often treats this second triumph as another proof of his divine favor and martial skill. Yet the method of the monster's defeat varies. In some accounts, Perseus kills Cetus with the same weapon that later turns enemies to stone, the severed head of Medusa. In others, he uses sword and shield in a more conventional combat. In still others, the clash is described only in broad strokes, as if the ancient author did not want to linger too long on the mechanics of slaying a sea creature. What matters is the transformation of the shore from a place of passive dread into one of sudden action. The waves that seem to encircle Andromeda as a sentence now frame a victory. There is something almost ceremonial about this reversal. The monster comes as punishment. The hero's intervention turns punishment into narrative release. In a poem or a painted vase, the scene might show the exact moment when the sea beast recoils, foam around its body, while the young woman still stands bound nearby, as though she must wait even after salvation for the world to catch up. At the center of the story is the question of Andromeda's own voice, which is sometimes overlooked because the myth is so often told through the actions of others. Ancient literature preserves only fragments of what she may have said, if anything, while chained to the rock. In some poetic renderings, she laments her fate, addresses her parents, or appeals to the gods. In others, she is nearly silent, becoming a visual and emotional emblem rather than a fully spoken character. But silence in myth is not emptiness. It can indicate shame, endurance, or a kind of dignity that needs no elaborate speech. The uncertainty around her words may also reflect the genre of the source: tragedy, epic, vase painting, local legend, or later retelling each handle her differently. What seems consistent is that Andromeda's presence invites interpretation. Is she afraid, resigned, hopeful, or already half outside ordinary life? The answer may vary by storyteller, yet in every version her stillness draws others toward her. She becomes a center of attention not because she speaks most loudly, but because the story itself pauses around her. That pause is one of the reasons her image has survived for so long. After the rescue comes another important phase of the myth, the claim of marriage and the disruption of the original promise. Andromeda had been offered to the sea monster, but now she is promised to Perseus, and this new arrangement does not proceed smoothly. Her relatives are not always eager to surrender her to the hero, especially if another suitor or family arrangement already existed. In some versions, there is a violent confrontation at the wedding feast, as rival claimants appear and blood is shed before the couple can be properly united. This part of the story reminds us that rescue does not erase social conflict. Even when danger is removed, human obligations remain tangled. The wedding is not a simple reward, but a transition into another arena of power, inheritance, and authority. Ancient audiences would have understood that marriage in myth often carries political significance, joining families, transferring status, and altering future lines of descent. Andromeda is not merely carried away from one danger into love. She is also transferred into a new structure of life, one shaped by Perseus' heroic reputation and by the expectations surrounding him. The myth moves from the sea to the household, and the household proves no less complicated than the shore. Andromeda's marriage to Perseus gives rise to one of the most important heroic genealogies in Greek myth. Through them come descendants who are linked to major cultural and legendary figures, most famously Heracles in later genealogical traditions. The bloodline matters because Greek myth often treats ancestry as a form of memory, a way of threading great events into the identities of later generations. Andromeda is therefore not only a rescued maiden but an ancestor. Her story becomes part of the long architecture by which the Greeks explained lineage, legitimacy, and noble origin. This genealogical importance is one reason the myth traveled so widely in antiquity. A single marriage could connect regional heroes, dynasties, and later dynastic claims. Families and cities like to imagine themselves tied to illustrious ancestors, and Andromeda's union with Perseus helped provide just such a chain. It is quiet, almost domestic mythology at first glance, but underneath it lies the old Greek fascination with descent as destiny. A woman chained to a rock becomes, in the end, the starting point of lineages that stretch far beyond the shore where she once waited. The transformation is startling, and perhaps intentionally so. Greek myth loves to turn catastrophe into continuity. One of the most enduring afterlives of Andromeda is the constellation that bears her name. Along with Perseus, Cassiopeia, Cepheus, and Cetus, she is placed in the sky as part of a celestial family drama. This is a beautiful kind of immortality, but it is also a peculiar one. To be made into a constellation is to become visible every year, yet fixed in a pattern that cannot change. The stars preserve the myth, but they also freeze it. Ancient astronomers and mythographers enjoyed this arrangement because it linked storytelling with observation. When people looked up at the night sky, they could imagine the ancient figures still present, not on a coastline now lost to time, but in the steady procession of the heavens. The constellation of Andromeda became a kind of memory palace in the sky, a way of holding the story in place across generations. Depending on the season and the viewer's latitude, the group of stars appears as a delicate line or shape, modest compared with some more dramatic constellations, and perhaps all the more moving for that restraint. The princess who once endured silence and threat now travels above the world, her story scattered into points of light. Ancient and later artists were especially drawn to the moment of rescue, and the reason is easy to feel. It holds fear, beauty, and motion all at once. On pottery, in sculpture, in frescoes, and later in Renaissance painting, Andromeda is often shown at the edge of the frame or central within it, emphasizing the contrast between her vulnerability and Perseus' movement. The monster may be suggested by a curved body, a shell-like outline, or a great dark mass in the water. Perseus often appears with his characteristic cap, winged sandals, or the shield that reflects the monstrous danger. What makes these depictions linger is not just the heroism but the suspended mood. The viewer is invited to witness a story at the exact point before resolution. Andromeda is still chained, the sea still looms, the hero is still preparing. This in-between state is artistically rich because it captures the essence of myth itself, the moment when mortal danger and divine help share the same air. Later audiences would continue to adapt the scene because it offered a perfect balance of drama and serenity, a story that can be told with tension without needing to become frantic. Even now, Andromeda remains one of myth's most enduring images of a life held in balance, waiting in the salt air for the world to change. In some of the oldest retellings, Andromeda is not introduced as a distant symbol, but as a daughter placed carefully inside a family network of kings, queens, and sea powers, where every relationship seems to echo across the Mediterranean world. Her father, Cepheus, rules in Ethiopia in many versions, though the exact geography shifts in the ancient imagination, and her mother, Cassiopeia, stands at the center of the story with a pride that is both human and dangerous. Around Andromeda, then, the myth begins as a domestic scene before it becomes a cosmic one. She is the child whose fate is shaped by the actions of her parents, which is a common pattern in Greek myth, where family honor and divine punishment are often woven together so tightly that they cannot be separated without tearing the story apart. And yet Andromeda herself remains gentle in outline, a figure of innocence rather than fault, and that innocence is part of what made her story so enduring. Ancient listeners could imagine her waiting in a palace by the sea, in a world of bright stone, salt wind, and royal ceremony, never expecting that her name would one day belong to the stars. From there, the myth deepens into a kind of warning about speech, especially boastful speech, which the Greeks treated as a force capable of unsettling the balance between mortals and gods. Cassiopeia's claim that she, or sometimes her daughter, was more beautiful than the sea nymphs is the spark that ignites the entire episode, and scholars have long noted how often Greek stories punish arrogance not only because it offends the divine, but because it disturbs the social order. Beauty in this myth is not simple admiration, it is power, competition, and comparison. The Nereids, graceful daughters of the sea, are not merely insulted in a personal sense, but placed within a wider system of cosmic dignity that must be respected. When Poseidon takes offense, the sea becomes an instrument of correction, and the punishment falls upon a kingdom that may not have committed the original offense in the same way. This detail has always given the story a bitter tenderness. Andromeda becomes the one who pays the visible price for an invisible imbalance, standing at the border between private vanity and public catastrophe, while the waves gather against the shore like a breathing, waiting force. The sea monster sent against the land is described in different ways by different ancient authors, and that variation itself is revealing. Sometimes it is a great serpent-like beast, sometimes more like a whale, sometimes a creature difficult to define at all, as if the ancient mind preferred ambiguity when imagining terror emerging from the deep. The Greeks did not separate the ocean cleanly from the unknown. The sea was not just water, but a threshold into danger, distance, and marvel. In that sense, the monster is not merely an animal in the modern sense, but a mythic expression of the sea's appetite, vast and impersonal. It rises from the same element that supports trade, travel, and life, yet it also threatens to swallow them. Andromeda's story captures that tension perfectly. She stands at the shore, near enough to feel the salt spray, near enough to hear the breaking waves, while the monster's approach transforms familiar nature into something ancient and predatory. The image is quiet in its horror. A young woman waiting on a rock, the sky pale above her, the surf bright below, and a terrible uncertainty hanging over the entire coastline. One of the most memorable parts of the myth, and one that ancient artists loved to depict, is Andromeda's binding. She is chained or fastened to a rock, often with her arms stretched in a posture of helplessness that has made the image unforgettable across centuries. The scene is visually simple, but its emotional force is enormous. It is the stillness before rescue, the pause where time seems to thicken. In Greek art, this kind of compositional clarity mattered a great deal. A single figure isolated against stone and sea could suggest vulnerability more powerfully than a crowd or a battlefield. The rock itself becomes almost a character, a cold and unmoving witness to human fear. There is also an unsettling ritual quality to it, as though Andromeda has been prepared for sacrifice, offered to appease forces that cannot otherwise be controlled. Yet she is not shown struggling wildly in most tellings. Instead, she is often calm, restrained, and mournful, a presence of sorrow rather than panic. That stillness may reflect the ancient ideal of noble suffering, but it also invites sympathy in a very direct way, because the listener is asked to imagine what it means to wait, unable to move, while the sea itself keeps coming. When Perseus arrives, the story shifts from sacrifice to sudden intervention, and the old mythic world becomes almost cinematic in its motion. Perseus is already a hero known for the severed head of Medusa, and so his appearance carries the momentum of previous adventures. He is not simply wandering by chance in most versions, but moving through the air or over the coast with the tools of divine aid, depending on the telling. The encounter between Perseus and Andromeda has often been read as a meeting of heroic prowess and helpless beauty, but that is only part of it. He asks about her, learns the cause of her fate, and only then offers help, sometimes with the condition that he may marry her if he succeeds. This negotiation is striking because it places romance and rescue side by side in a way that feels very old, very human, and somewhat uncomfortable to modern readers. The ancient audience would have recognized the seriousness of such an exchange. Marriage in myth is rarely just affection, it is alliance, reward, and social order restored. Yet even in that framework, there is a bright emotional current here. Andromeda is not merely a passive object in the scene. She becomes the reason Perseus' heroism matters, and the future of the story bends around the moment when one person chooses to stop and look at another with pity. The battle with the monster is often told quickly, but it contains a great deal of symbolic weight. Perseus uses the head of Medusa in some versions, turning the enemy to stone, though other accounts emphasize weapons and direct combat. This flexibility tells us something about myth itself, which was not always fixed in the way later literature tends to be. Ancient storytellers adapted details for local audiences, artistic preferences, and poetic needs. Whether the monster is slain by blade or petrified by divine terror, the essential idea is the same. Chaos is halted through a combination of courage, cunning, and supernatural aid. Perseus is a hero whose victories are rarely purely physical. He wins because he has been given extraordinary tools and because he knows how to use them. The monster's defeat, therefore, becomes less about brute strength than about the triumph of ordered power over formless danger. In a sleepy, reflective way, it is almost like watching a storm pass. The water that seemed unstoppable is checked, the threat recedes, and the air begins to feel different. Andromeda's rescue is dramatic, but it is also strangely quiet in its aftermath, as if the shoreline itself inhales after holding its breath. After the rescue comes one of the most humanly complicated parts of the story, the negotiations of kinship, duty, and desire. Perseus is not simply welcomed as a savior in every version. Often, Andromeda has already been promised to another man, usually a relative, and that man resists the marriage claim with anger and violence. The scene reveals how myths often place women at the intersection of competing male claims: father, suitor, hero, king. Andromeda's own voice is less frequently emphasized in the ancient sources, but her situation is clear enough. She is moved from one kind of obligation into another, from sacrificial victim to marriage prize, which makes her story more than a rescue tale. It is also a story about the reordering of power. The banquet hall where conflict erupts is very different from the rocky shore. There are cups, torches, bodies gathered in festivity or formal welcome, and then suddenly the atmosphere becomes tense, metallic, and dangerous again. Ancient readers would have understood the fragility of peace in such scenes. A marriage alliance could unite houses, but it could also provoke rivals and expose old obligations. Andromeda's future, so briefly secured, is made dramatic once more by the social web around her. Later tradition often softens or romanticizes Andromeda, but the earliest layers of the myth preserve a sense of estrangement that is easy to miss. She is a princess whose life is determined by forces larger than herself, yet she is also a foreign figure in some tellings, placed in Ethiopia or a similarly remote region at the edge of the known world. That remoteness matters. Greek myths often set their most marvelous events at the borders of maps, in places where civilization seems to thin out into wonder. Andromeda belongs to that borderland. She is royal but distant, human but almost already legendary before the rescue occurs. Ancient geography, of course, was not our geography. The word Ethiopia could mean a broad and shifting southern land of dark or sun-burnished peoples, imagined through Greek eyes rather than defined by modern borders. This makes the myth a meeting point of cultural imagination as much as a fixed story. The coastline, the palace, the monster, the foreign kingdom, and the coming hero all contribute to a sense of the world as large, strange, and interconnected. In that spacious ancient world, Andromeda's suffering could travel from one poet to another and still feel fresh, because it rested on universal emotions framed by wondrous distance. As the myth moved into later Greek and Roman culture, Andromeda became especially beloved by artists because her story was so visually clear and emotionally immediate. Vase painters, sculptors, wall painters, and later astronomers all found in her a figure who could be shown at the exact hinge between danger and deliverance. One moment she is bound, the next she is freed. That transition is ideal for art, because art loves poised moments, suspended action, a body caught between one state and another. In Roman houses, scenes of Andromeda and Perseus could decorate dining rooms and chambers, turning a violent myth into an object of contemplation. The viewer would have seen not only the maiden and the hero, but also the broad sea, the rock, and perhaps the looming beast, all arranged in a composition that balanced beauty with dread. There is something soothing, in a strange way, about the repetition of the image across centuries. It suggests that ancient people returned to this story not just because it was dramatic, but because it held together several deep anxieties: helplessness, family disgrace, divine anger, and the hope that help might still arrive. One quiet but important detail in the tradition is that Andromeda's story does not end with rescue. She goes on to marry Perseus, and their union becomes part of the wider mythic genealogy that connects heroic lines across generations. Through their children, Andromeda enters the family trees of later heroes and dynasties, especially in traditions that emphasize ancestry as a way of explaining the past. Greek myth often thinks in terms of descent, where the future is folded into the present through children whose names may themselves become famous. Andromeda, then, is not only a saved maiden but also a founder figure, though not in the loud imperial sense. Her legacy is quieter and more domestic, woven through lineage rather than conquest. This can be easy to overlook because her rescue scene is so famous, but the genealogical dimension matters. It gives her a place in the continuity of myth, where one generation leads to another, and stories are carried forward by blood, marriage, and memory. In this sense, Andromeda is both the ending of one crisis and the beginning of another family history, a hinge between catastrophe and continuation. Eventually, Andromeda rises beyond story into the heavens, where her name becomes one of the most familiar constellations in the night sky. The placing of mythic figures among the stars was a deeply Greek way of honoring memory, but also a way of making narrative visible across the year. To look up at Andromeda in the sky is to encounter a shape made of light and distance, a faint pattern that requires patience to see. That patience suits her. Her earthly story involves waiting, watching, and enduring, and her celestial form preserves that atmosphere. The constellation is not bright in the way some others are bright. It is subtle, extended, and best recognized gradually. This gives it a kind of sleep-friendly serenity, as though the heavens themselves had softened the drama of the myth into a quiet diagram. Around Andromeda in the sky are other related figures, including Perseus and Cassiopeia, so that the whole family becomes a celestial group, fixed in an eternal arrangement. Ancient stargazers may have seen this as divine memorialization, a reminder that stories of suffering and rescue do not vanish, but are written into the cosmos above the sea. And so Andromeda's myth lingers not because it is only a tale of danger or only a tale of romance, but because it gathers together so many ancient concerns into one clear image. A daughter stands by the sea, a family's pride triggers divine anger, a monster comes from the deep, a hero appears at the edge of time, a marriage follows rescue, a story becomes a constellation. There is a kind of calm in the way these elements fit together, even though the events themselves are intense, because the myth offers a pattern where chaos is finally given shape. The waves can be imagined as settling, the rock remains, the stars return. And Andromeda, once bound in human fear, becomes one of the quiet figures that holds the night in place. When scholars trace Andromeda through the oldest Greek sources, one of the first things they notice is how quietly she enters the story. She is not introduced with great speeches or long personal histories. Instead, she appears as a figure at the edge of a larger divine and heroic crisis, a princess whose fate is tied to the sea, the sky, and the temper of the gods. That quiet entrance is meaningful. In Greek myth, characters who seem briefly illuminated often carry the strongest symbolic weight, and Andromeda is one of those figures. Her name becomes attached not only to a rescue narrative, but to a whole pattern of images: a vulnerable body, a vast coastline, the threat of sacrifice, and then the sudden arrival of salvation. What is especially interesting is that the ancient imagination never seems entirely finished with her. She is a mythic person, but also a recurring shape, a symbol that can be moved into poetry, astronomy, art, and local tradition without ever losing her original stillness. The setting of her myth, Ethiopia in Greek terms, also invites a certain kind of historical caution. Ancient writers did not mean the modern nation-state in the way we might think of it now. Their Ethiopia was often a distant southern land, a place imagined at the edges of the known world, where sunlight was strong and the sea was strangely near the horizon of civilization. In some versions, Andromeda is the daughter of a king who rules there. In others, the details are softened or altered by later retellings. What remains constant is the sense of remoteness. She belongs to a place that feels far from the centers of Greek urban life, a place where the myth can gather a little more grandeur simply because it is not fully mapped. That distance matters. It gives the tale a dreamlike quality, as if Andromeda were standing at the boundary between familiar human order and something much older, larger, and more dangerous. One of the most striking aspects of her story is the role of her parents, particularly Cassiopeia and Cepheus. They are not merely background figures, they are part of the moral architecture of the myth. Cassiopeia's boast about her daughter's beauty, depending on the source, whether prideful comparison with the Nereids or some other form of offense, becomes the immediate spark for the disaster. Cepheus, meanwhile, is often depicted less as a villain than as a king caught inside an impossible situation, forced to consider the terrible demand of a god or sea monster. This is one reason the myth lingers so powerfully in the imagination. It is not simply about a monster attacking a kingdom. It is about the fragile line between human speech and cosmic consequence. A boast, a complaint, a rash decision, and suddenly a young woman's body becomes the site where a community tries to pay a divine debt. The atmosphere is tragic, but also deeply ritualized, as if the story were preserving a memory of older sacrificial thinking. Andromeda herself is often shown bound to a rock, and the image has been preserved so vividly in later art that it nearly defines her. Yet in mythic terms, the rock is more than a prop. It is a threshold object, fixed, cold, exposed to the spray of the sea and the sound of distant waves. She is not simply waiting, she is suspended between outcomes, a condition that Greek myth sometimes used to intensify vulnerability. The body is made still so that the mind of the listener cannot look away. The surrounding environment matters too. The sea is not only a backdrop but an active presence, breathing, reflecting, threatening. Ancient audiences, especially those familiar with coastal life, would have understood how quickly the sea can change from beautiful to ruinous. In that setting, Andromeda's helplessness is not abstract. It feels physical, immediate, and almost audible in the imagined crash of water against stone. The hero Perseus arrives at exactly the point where the story wants movement again, yet even his rescue is not as simple as it can seem in later romanticized versions. In some tellings, he sees Andromeda and falls at once into admiration. In others, he first asks about the cause of her suffering, negotiating with her parents and the royal household before committing himself. The ancient sources differ on this sequence, and those differences are worth noticing because they show how flexible the myth really was. Sometimes the emphasis is on desire, sometimes on heroic justice, and sometimes on the formal exchange that precedes marriage. Perseus is a slayer of monsters, but he is also a negotiator in a royal court. The myth lets him be both. Andromeda's rescue therefore becomes a hinge between violence and alliance, between peril at sea and the quiet recalibration of kinship on land. The monster itself, often called Cetus, is another place where the tradition remains somewhat fluid. Later readers sometimes imagine a single enormous sea beast, but ancient depictions and texts do not always agree on its exact form. It may be whale-like, serpent-like, or simply monstrous in a broad sense, a creature of the deep that stands for the unpredictability of marine power. Greek myth often prefers such partial clarity. The monster need not be anatomically precise to be effective. What matters is that it embodies the fear of what comes from beyond the human world. In some retellings, Perseus uses the severed head of Medusa to turn the creature to stone. In others, he fights more directly. The petrifying power of Medusa, itself a kind of mythic residue of terror, becomes the instrument by which Andromeda's threat is ended. So even in rescue, the story is layered with images of stillness, transformation, and the strange exchange of life for immobility. After the rescue, Andromeda does not disappear. She enters a marriage narrative that is sometimes celebrated and sometimes tense. Perseus has effectively claimed her in the moment of victory, but her parents, her prior betrothal in some versions, and the politics of the court all complicate the union. The wedding feast itself, in the famous story, becomes another violent scene when a rival appears and conflict breaks out. This is important because it prevents the myth from settling too easily into a simple, happy ending. Andromeda is rescued from one form of danger, only to move immediately into another narrative zone where social claims, jealousy, and honor all collide. Ancient myth often refuses clean transitions. One event folds into the next, and the listener is left with the sense that safety is always temporary, especially when it has been won through extraordinary means. Andromeda's story keeps that tension alive, quietly and persistently. In literature, Andromeda's presence sometimes serves as a test of eloquence as much as of bravery. Poets and dramatists could use her figure to explore the language of pleading, admiration, and pity. There is evidence that tragic treatments of the myth once existed in forms now lost, and later writers clearly knew the story well enough to allude to it with little explanation. Her image could evoke pathos almost instantly. A woman exposed to the sea, a community unable to save her, a hero arriving at the exact moment of crisis. These elements create a compact emotional structure that ancient audiences would have recognized at once. Even when the specific details vary, the emotional rhythm remains steady. First the public danger, then the silence of the bound figure, then the heroic intervention, and finally the uneasy calm after the storm. That rhythm may be one reason the myth traveled so easily across genres and centuries. There is also a quieter question beneath the story. What kind of agency does Andromeda possess? Ancient myth often grants her very little visible action, and modern readers naturally notice this. But absence of action is not the same as absence of significance. Andromeda becomes the focal point through which the actions of others are judged. Her beauty, her suffering, her proposed sacrifice, and her marriage all reveal the moral and political character of those around her. In that sense, she is not passive in the structure of the myth, even if she is physically constrained within it. The Greeks often wrote stories in which women's bodies become symbolic sites of communal anxiety, divine anger, and heroic value. Andromeda belongs to that pattern, but she also exceeds it, because her image endures far beyond the logic that first placed her on the rock. She continues to mean more than the role assigned to her. Her transformation into a constellation is one of the most enduring afterlives of the myth, and it gently shifts the mood of her story from danger into distance. In the sky, Andromeda is no longer threatened by the sea, though she remains connected to the larger family of constellations around her. Cepheus, Cassiopeia, Perseus, and the creature linked to her rescue. The sky preserves the whole drama as a kind of celestial family tableau. This is a very Greek solution to mythic memory, turning narrative into pattern, suffering into placement, and history into visible arrangement. The stars do not tell the story in words, of course, but they allow later observers to imagine the old tale hanging above them in a calm and eternal form. From the earth, one could look up and see not just points of light, but a family of names stretched across the darkness. Andromeda's ascent to the heavens is therefore both a consolation and a continuation. Astronomically, the constellation of Andromeda has also gathered more meaning over time than the ancient myth alone could contain. Modern observers know it for the Andromeda galaxy, one of the nearest large galaxies to our own. That later scientific naming is not part of Greek mythology in a historical sense, but it is a remarkable continuation of her cultural life. A figure once bound beside the sea now lends her name to an immense island universe of stars. There is something almost fitting in that expansion. The myth began with distance, with a kingdom at the edge of the world, and it has remained associated with vastness ever since. Even as astronomy moved far beyond mythic geography, the old name survived and grew larger, as if Andromeda had always belonged to the idea of reaching outward into the dark. Ancient art often shows Andromeda in a way that emphasizes both vulnerability and composure. She may be chained, draped, half-turned, or placed beside the rock in a pose that is both elegant and sorrowful. The visual tradition does not always seek realism. Instead, it tries to balance beauty with suffering, making her the center of a scene that is meant to be looked at carefully and perhaps reverently. Vase paintings, frescoes, later Roman mosaics, and Renaissance reinterpretations all inherited this visual grammar in different forms. What stays constant is the poised tension of the body against the surrounding threat. In some works she appears serene, almost detached, as if myth itself has softened her fear. In others, the posture is more obviously distressed. This artistic variety tells us something important. Andromeda was never just one image. She was a flexible emblem through which different ages could think about rescue, beauty, exposure, and fate. By the time later writers and scholars reflected on her myth, Andromeda had become a figure capable of carrying many interpretations at once. She can be read as a sacrificial victim, a princess of a distant kingdom, a symbol of celestial order, a subject of heroic love, and a reminder that ancient stories often preserve the tension between public necessity and private suffering. The uncertainty in her tale is part of its lasting power. We do not know exactly how the earliest audiences imagined her face, her voice, or her inner thoughts, and perhaps that is why she remains so haunting. She is defined by the spaces around her as much as by the lines of the story itself. Sea, rock, monster, hero, stars. Those are the frames, but within them she continues to hold a quiet stillness, as if waiting not only to be rescued but to be remembered. In many later retellings, Andromeda's story becomes tied not only to rescue, but to a wider pattern of Greek myths in which a beautiful mortal woman is placed at the center of a conflict that began long before her birth. Her fate is often presented as though it were personal, as though the gods and the sea had singled out one household in particular, yet the older mythic atmosphere is less precise and more shadowed. Andromeda stands within a family line marked by pride, punishment, and divine attention, and that family background matters because Greek myth rarely treats suffering as isolated. It tends to spread outward from parents to children, from one generation to the next, like a slow tide reaching farther up the shore. In this sense, Andromeda is not just the chained maiden on the rock. She is also the visible point where an older royal story becomes suddenly and terribly clear. Some ancient writers place special emphasis on the geography of her ordeal, and that landscape gives the myth a particular stillness. She is fixed beside the sea, exposed to wind and salt and the sound of water striking stone, a setting that feels almost cinematic even in its oldest forms. The rock itself is often imagined as a harsh boundary between land and ocean, human society and the unknown. That in-between space is important. Greek myth often loves thresholds, and Andromeda waits on one of the most frightening thresholds imaginable. She is neither at home nor at sea, neither fully condemned nor fully saved, suspended in a moment that seems to stretch beyond ordinary time. For a listener, this image can feel surprisingly quiet. The drama is intense, but the setting is silent, and that silence has helped make Andromeda's story endure across centuries. It is also worth noticing how often Andromeda's beauty is described in the language of comparison, as though human words can only approach it indirectly. Ancient authors rarely agree on exact details, but they repeatedly insist that she was remarkable enough to draw notice from a monster, a hero, and the gods themselves. In mythic storytelling, beauty is not merely decorative. It is often a force that changes events, although not always for the better. With Andromeda, beauty becomes both the reason for peril and the reason for rescue, and that double role reflects a common Greek pattern. The same quality that elevates a person can also make them vulnerable to envy, prophecy, or divine scrutiny. Andromeda's beauty, then, is not just a feature of her appearance. It is part of the machinery of the myth, quiet at first, then suddenly decisive. A fascinating detail in the tradition is the uncertainty surrounding her exact homeland. Many readers know her as an Ethiopian princess, but ancient Ethiopia was not the modern nation in the contemporary sense. In Greek imagination, it was a broad and somewhat elastic term, often referring to lands at the edges of the known world, where the sun seemed stronger and the sea more mysterious. Some versions place her in places connected with Africa, while others are less geographically definite. This flexibility is typical of myth, which often cares more about symbolic distance than cartographic accuracy. Andromeda lives at the edge of the map, which is also the edge of the familiar moral world. The sea, the monster, the sacrifice, and the arrival of Perseus all feel more dramatic because they happen in a place that the Greek mind could imagine as remote, luminous, and a little uncanny. The story of her rescue also belongs to a larger pattern in which heroes arrive just in time to interrupt a ritual death. Greek myth frequently stages these moments with a kind of terrible elegance. The victim is prepared, the community is watching, the future seems already decided, Then a hero appears from elsewhere, often traveling under divine guidance or by accident that is really fate. Perseus sees Andromeda and offers help, but the help is never simple. He asks for her hand in marriage, and in some versions her father's consent is immediately tied to the promise of deliverance. The scene reminds us that even rescue in myth is negotiated. Salvation comes with terms. Modern readers may pause at this, and rightly so, because the emotional structure feels uneasy. Yet that unease is part of the old story's lasting power. It does not flatter human relationships. It shows them as entangled with power, obligation, and survival. As the tale continued into later art and literature, Andromeda began to function almost like a quiet emblem of rescue itself. She appears in paintings, mosaics, vase scenes, and poetic references, often positioned with her body turned in a graceful but helpless curve toward the sea or toward the approaching hero. Artists seem to have been drawn to the contrast between stillness and motion, the bound woman and the airborne savior, the cliff and the wave, the waiting and the sudden arrival. In some depictions, the monster is enormous and vivid. In others, it is reduced to a more symbolic shape, allowing Andromeda's face and posture to carry the emotional weight. This artistic afterlife is important because it shows how myths change when they are remembered not just as stories, but as images. Andromeda becomes something almost meditative in visual culture, a figure of suspended breath. There is also a softer, more domestic thread in the tradition after the rescue itself. Once saved, Andromeda is usually brought into marriage with Perseus, and their union becomes part of the heroic genealogy of later myths. Through them, lines of descent are traced toward later figures, including descendants associated with strength, rulership, and further adventures. This is one reason Andromeda matters beyond her own episode. Greek myth is often interested in what a single marriage can generate over time, as though one encounter on a rocky shore could ripple forward through generations. Andromeda, in that sense, is not only an individual heroine in distress. She becomes an ancestor within a mythic family web, helping to connect one famous age of stories to another. The calmness of that genealogical role may be less dramatic than the monster, but it is just as enduring. What makes her story especially interesting to scholars is that it seems to absorb older and newer layers at once. Some elements feel like a very ancient local legend about sacrifice and sea power. Other elements, especially the polished heroic framing and the dramatic intervention of Perseus, seem shaped by later epic taste. Myth often works this way. It is not a single frozen text, but a living accumulation of versions, each one slightly altering the balance of emphasis. Andromeda may originally have belonged to a regional tale about a princess threatened by a sea creature and released through some divine or heroic act. Later poets then placed Perseus at the center, woven neatly into the well-known cycle of his travels. The result is a story that feels both timeless and assembled, like an old shoreline made of many layers of stone. The monster itself, called Cetus in many sources, deserves a quiet moment of attention because it reflects the ancient imagination's relationship with the sea. Greek myth does not always make monsters purely evil in a modern sense. Often they are embodiments of danger, vastness, or divine displeasure. The sea, after all, can be generous and terrifying in equal measure. A monster emerging from it is therefore not just a creature to be slain, but a shape given to the anxiety people felt about the unknown force outside their fields and harbors. In Andromeda's story, Cetus is the problem that must be faced before order can return. Yet the monster is also part of the atmosphere that gives the story its depth. Without that oceanic threat, the rocky cliff would be only a setting. With it, the whole scene becomes a portrait of fragile human life beside an immense and unsettled world. One of the most enduring reasons Andromeda remains memorable is that she is neither entirely passive nor entirely active in the way later audiences sometimes expect. She does not slay the monster. She does not command the rescue, but she is not meaningless or decorative either. The myth centers her as the reason the action matters. Without her presence, Perseus' arrival would be just another heroic episode. With her, the scene becomes emotionally charged and morally legible. Ancient myth often distributes agency in this way, creating figures whose importance comes from a combination of vulnerability, beauty, lineage, and the dramatic needs of fate. Andromeda's calm endurance on the cliff can therefore be read as a form of mythic power in itself. She waits in a state that the story treats as profoundly consequential. And then there is the strange, almost dreamlike quality of the ending. When the danger passes, the tale does not simply dissolve. Instead, it opens into another phase of life, marriage, and destiny. This transition is gentle in outline but enormous in implication. The maiden who was once bound to stone becomes part of a royal and heroic future. The sea which threatened her now recedes into memory. In many versions, she is later honored among the stars, because the Greeks loved to lift important stories into the sky and preserve them in constellations. That celestial afterlife suits her beautifully. It turns the violent shoreline episode into something distant and quiet, an image of rescue transformed into a pattern of light. In that way, Andromeda's myth ends not with noise, but with a kind of lasting stillness that can be looked at from below. So when Andromeda appears in the sky, or in a painting, or in an ancient text, she carries more than one meaning at once. She is the princess offered to a monster, the daughter of a troubled house, the wife of a hero, the ancestor of further legends, and the figure whose patience on a cliff became one of the most famous scenes in Greek myth. Her story survives because it gathers so many ancient concerns into one image: danger at the edge of the world, beauty under threat, rescue with conditions, and a life transformed by events beyond her control. And yet there is still something peaceful in the way the story is remembered. The sea may rage in the background, but the image that remains most strongly is often that of stillness. A woman beside the water, a waiting figure, a quiet sky. By the time later poets and mythographers return to Andromeda, they are often less interested in her danger than in her place within a larger family story, and that family story is where she becomes especially important. In some traditions, she belongs to a royal house that carries the weight of distant memories, half-legendary ancestry, and divine entanglements stretching far beyond a single rescue. This is part of what makes her so enduring in myth. She is never only the girl on the rock beside the sea. She is also a princess within a long chain of descent, a link between kingdoms, generations, and the ancient idea that human suffering can be inherited like a household burden. In the quieter retellings, that sense of lineage gives the story a more reflective shape. Andromeda stands at the meeting point of past actions and future consequences, as though the entire family has been moving toward that shoreline for a very long time. That feeling deepens when one notices how often Greek myth explains calamity through the logic of ancestry. A parent's offense, a mother's boast, a grandfather's judgment, or a god's old resentment can all echo down into the life of a child. Andromeda's punishment in many versions is not imagined as isolated or accidental. It belongs to a pattern in which the young suffer for the pride, error, or vulnerability of those around them. For modern readers, that can feel harsh, but in the mythic world it creates a kind of moral weather system. No one stands alone. A household becomes a site where divine attention gathers, and where beauty, status, and danger can all arrive together. Andromeda's legend therefore feels calm and terrible at once, because it reveals a world in which even a princess may be only one thread in a much larger weave. Her story also survives because ancient authors were fascinated by the moment of rescue as much as by the threat itself. Once Perseus appears, the atmosphere changes from sacrifice and dread to movement, negotiation, and unfolding possibility. Yet the rescue is not always told simply as an act of bravery. In some accounts, it is a transaction with conditions, a public claim, or a contested right. Andromeda is not always treated as if she were merely waiting to be saved. Rather, her fate becomes the subject of dispute among men who believe they possess authority over her body, her hand in marriage, or her future. That aspect is quietly sobering. The myth is not only about a monster by the sea. It is also about the social structures that place a young woman in the center of a conflict she did not create. And so the tale drifts between grandeur and vulnerability, between the bright heroism of Perseus and the very human question of who gets to decide a life. This is one reason Andromeda's image became so compelling in later art. Painters, vase makers, sculptors, and mosaic artists found in her a figure of elegant stillness. She could be shown bound to stone, partially draped, looking out toward the water, or turning toward the horizon as if listening for something beyond sight. Artists seem to understand that her power came from restraint rather than motion. A less careful figure might have been rendered in agitation, but Andromeda often appears almost dreamlike, her posture composed even in distress. That visual calm made her a favorite subject for display in palaces, villas, and public settings, where the scene could suggest both beauty and peril without needing words. The image invited contemplation. It asked viewers to look closely at the line between fragility and grace, and to notice how myth can transform suffering into a formal arrangement of light, cloth, and stone. In the classical imagination, that balance between beauty and danger was never far from the sea itself. The coast in Greek myth is often a threshold place, neither land nor open water, a place where one order ends and another begins. Andromeda's punishment places her exactly there at the edge of civilization. The shoreline becomes a kind of suspended world, with waves repeating softly below and sky pressing down from above. Even the monster, in many versions, seems to belong to that transitional zone, neither fully natural nor fully imagined away. The scene is therefore not just dramatic, it is spatially symbolic. Andromeda is located where boundaries break down. Royal safety does not protect her. The city is not close enough. The sea is not yet fully in command. She waits in a narrow strip of exposure, which may be one reason the image stays so vivid. It feels like a place where the human condition itself has been briefly set out in the open. Ancient storytellers also like to place Andromeda within a network of regional identities, and that gives her legend a kind of geographical richness. Different places claimed her. Different communities remembered her with local pride. In some traditions, she is associated with Ethiopia, in others with broader eastern lands that were only loosely imagined by Greek authors, and in later interpretations her story takes on a more flexible borderland quality. Greek myth was never fully fixed in the way a modern retelling might be. It moved through city-states, cult sites, and literary schools, adapting to local memory and curiosity. That means Andromeda's tale may have been shaped not only by poets but by travelers, temple traditions, and the desire of communities to anchor universal themes in familiar ground. The result is a story that feels at once intimate and far-reaching. She is one figure, but she belongs to many landscapes. There is also something quietly fascinating about the way the ancients linked Andromeda to the stars. The sky, for Greek myth, was not merely empty space. It was a place of memory, a record of transformed lives, and a map of stories that could be read in the dark. Andromeda becomes a constellation, and with that change she enters a different kind of eternity. No longer only a princess, no longer only a rescued maiden, she becomes a figure visible from the earth across generations. That celestial fate suited the mythic temperament because it turned narrative into navigation. Travelers could look up and see a reminder of the legend, while poets could imagine her continuing in a calmer realm above the earth. The stars do not end her story, they suspend it. They preserve her outline in a cool, distant way, as though the heavens themselves had chosen to remember her. The constellation also reveals how ancient myth often transformed suffering into pattern. The night sky is full of figures whose stories are arranged in relation to one another: father, mother, daughter, hero, monster, and sea. Andromeda's place among them means her legend was not simply told, but looked at, repeated, and quietly contemplated over long periods of time. In a culture that observed the heavens as carefully as it told stories, this mattered. A myth could become a fixed arrangement overhead, while still carrying emotional resonance below. One can imagine a still night, a sailor or shepherd looking upward and finding in the stars not only beauty, but a reminder that ancient pain had been folded into cosmic order. Andromeda, in that sense, becomes part of the ancient human wish to see troubled lives lifted into a larger and more enduring frame. The poets who retold her story also tended to place her in relation to Perseus in ways that softened the edges of the original crisis. Once she becomes his wife, she enters a new network of heroic descendants and household drama. Their marriage is often presented as the happy ending, though mythology rarely allows happiness to remain simple for long. The couple's descendants matter because they connect Andromeda to later heroic lineages, especially in traditions that link their family to kings and founders. This is a common pattern in Greek myth. Rescue leads to marriage, marriage leads to ancestry, and ancestry leads to political legitimacy. The myth is doing more than telling a dramatic story. It is helping explain how later houses claimed prestige, how heroic bloodlines were imagined, and how myth could be used to make history feel rooted in divine or legendary beginnings. Andromeda, then, is not only a passive figure in a rescue scene. She becomes an ancestor in a story about continuity. That continuity is also visible in the way her myth absorbed older motifs that may have existed long before the classical literary versions. Scholars have long noticed that tales of a threatened maiden, a sea monster, and a hero arriving in time are widespread across cultures. Greek myth gave the pattern its own language and family detail, but it may not have invented the deep structure from nothing. This is one of the reasons Andromeda remains interesting to researchers. Her story feels both distinct and archetypal, both carefully Greek and strangely universal. The uncertainty around its earliest form leaves room for respectful imagination. Perhaps local ritual memory fed the legend. Perhaps earlier Eastern tales were adapted through Greek storytelling habits. Perhaps the myth gathered pieces from multiple sources over time. We cannot know with certainty, and that uncertainty itself is part of the quiet fascination. The tale is old enough to have worn smooth at the edges, yet vivid enough to retain its emotional shape. In literature, Andromeda often serves as a bridge between spectacle and tenderness. Writers who focus on Perseus sometimes pause at her appearance because she offers a moment of stillness within the motion of adventure. She is the image that arrests the narrative. The hero may be in flight, armed with divine gifts, pursued by enemies and driven by urgency, but when he sees Andromeda, the story slows. The eye lingers. The rescue becomes not merely an exploit, but a meeting. This pause matters. It allows the audience to notice that heroism is often defined by attention, by the ability to recognize vulnerability before it disappears. Andromeda's presence therefore changes the rhythm of the myth. She creates a hush in the middle of movement, and that hush may be one reason her figure lingered so powerfully in the ancient imagination. That hush extends to the way later readers have responded to her silence. Andromeda is not remembered for speeches in the same way some mythic women are. She is remembered through image, through situation, through the tension of waiting. Yet silence in myth should not be mistaken for emptiness. It can also suggest endurance, inwardness, and the refusal of a story to be exhausted by its loudest voices. Her quietness gives interpreters room to think about what was not written down: fear, prayer, dignity, resignation, hope. Ancient texts often tell us what happened, but not entirely how it felt. Andromeda's character survives partly because those feelings remain open. She stands in the record like a still point, and that stillness invites slow thought. It makes the old story feel less like a concluded event and more like a held breath. Even the monster in her myth contributes to this atmosphere of ambiguity. Depending on the source, it is a sea beast sent by divine anger, a vast and destructive creature, or a more loosely described threat rising from the waters. The exact form changes, but the function remains constant. The monster embodies the scale of danger that human society cannot easily manage. In myths like this, monsters often do not exist merely for terror. They represent imbalance, offense, or the overwhelming force of the natural world when it is imagined as hostile. Andromeda's danger is therefore not only personal but cosmic in tone. A kingdom has offended the powers beyond itself, and the sea answers. That response may feel symbolic rather than literal, but it gives the story weight. It suggests that in the old mythic mind, human actions were rarely private. They could send ripples outward into the visible world, where they returned in the shape of waves, omens, and enormous creatures from the deep. And yet, for all the dread surrounding her, Andromeda's final place in myth is marked by endurance rather than disappearance. She survives the shoreline. She enters marriage, ancestry, and the sky. She becomes one of those figures who can be seen in several forms at once: as daughter, as victim of circumstance, as wife, as mother, as constellation, as subject of art, as symbol of peril and rescue. The ancient world loved such layered identities. It allowed a single name to hold grief and honor together, to keep vulnerability in the same space as elevation. Andromeda's myth endures because it understands that a life can be both threatened and preserved, both human and elevated, both local and celestial. In the old Greek imagination, that was not a contradiction. It was the very shape of legend. By the final stretch of Andromeda's story, the ancient world has already transformed her into more than a princess bound to a rock. She becomes a figure that can travel across languages, dynasties, and artistic tastes, and still remain recognizable in the faint outline of her suffering and release. In later retellings, the emphasis often shifts away from the terror of the sea monster and toward the quieter, more reflective image of a woman waiting at the edge of fate. That waiting, so simple in description, becomes one of the most enduring parts of her myth. It is a pause before rescue, a breath held in the warm air of a coastline, a human stillness set against the immense motion of waves, gods, and monsters. Ancient writers did not always dwell on her emotions, yet later readers naturally lingered there, imagining what it meant to be exposed to the sky, to the spray of salt, to the long uncertainty of rescue. In that sense, Andromeda becomes almost a landscape of feeling. She stands where land gives way to sea, where household order gives way to public danger, where a royal daughter becomes a witness to divine judgment and divine mercy. The myth keeps returning to that threshold, as if the story itself cannot leave the shore. One reason Andromeda remained so memorable is that she was absorbed into a larger network of sky lore. After her rescue and marriage to Perseus, the family did not simply vanish back into legend. Instead, they were placed among the stars. The heavens, in Greek thought, could serve as a kind of final archive, preserving not only heroes but whole family lines, uneasy histories, and sacred honors. Andromeda's constellation became one of the most visible reminders of this process. For ancient observers, the night sky was not a blank field but a crowded map of memory. To look up and identify Andromeda was to recall the girl at the rock, but also the entire web of kinship around her: Cepheus, Cassiopeia, Perseus, and even the vanquished sea beast in neighboring stellar forms. There is something gently haunting about that arrangement. It suggests that myth was not confined to books or temples, but spread overhead, available to shepherds, sailors, and anyone who could follow the familiar patterns of light through the dark. The constellation did not preserve a finished moral so much as a continuing presence. Night after night, season after season, Andromeda remained there, suspended between rescue and remembrance. Ancient astronomers and poets sometimes treated the sky as if it were a living theatre, and Andromeda's place in it gave the myth a second life that was calmer than the dramatic rescue scene, yet no less powerful. A constellation can be both a marker and a meditation. It is fixed, but it seems to move. It belongs to everyone, but each person sees it from a different latitude, under a different weathered night. Andromeda's stars were not bright like the most famous constellations, but their very modesty may have helped the story endure. They required a patient gaze. They invited the viewer to search, to trace a shape gradually, almost uncertainly, and to imagine a princess in the open sky. That slow act of recognition is close to the nature of myth itself. The outline is incomplete, the imagination quietly finishes it. In this way, the heavens preserve something central to Andromeda's tale: vulnerability. She is not monumental in the way of a conquering god or thunder-wielding king. She is delicate, placed in a vast, cool darkness, visible because she was once endangered and remembered. The stars make that memory peaceful, even when the story began in fear. From the perspective of Greek art, Andromeda also survived through repeated reinvention. Vase painters, sculptors, mosaics, and later Roman artists all found ways to depict her in forms that balanced exposure with dignity. Sometimes she appears clearly chained, sometimes partially draped, sometimes almost like a sleeping figure, absorbed into the landscape rather than struggling against it. Such variation is important because it shows that the myth was never fixed to one emotional register. Artists could emphasize her as victim, bride, royal daughter, or celestial maiden. In some images, Perseus approaches with a poised confidence. In others, the monster looms like a dark shape at the edge of the composition, more symbol than creature. Andromeda herself often occupies the center, or the point where the eye naturally rests, even though she is not the one acting. That artistic choice may reflect an old fascination with stillness under pressure. The chain, the cliff, the sea, and the waiting body create a scene of intense quiet. For modern viewers, and perhaps for some ancient ones as well, the appeal lies partly in the tension between helplessness and grace. She is shown at the moment before change, when the world seems to hold its breath. That image has a lasting softness to it, even in media that also convey dread. Andromeda's myth also became valuable because it could be folded into family histories that mattered deeply to Greek audiences. Her marriage to Perseus linked two famous houses, and their descendants were treated as ancestors of later heroes and kings. In mythic genealogy, this mattered almost as much as the rescue itself. The story did not end with the killing of the sea monster. It continued into succession, inheritance, and the founding of lineages that writers could attach to cities and ruling families. Greek and later Roman traditions often like to explain present authority by tracing it back through heroic bloodlines, and Andromeda helped anchor one such chain. Through her, the narrative of a threatened princess became a narrative of continuity. There is a quiet irony in that. A woman who is presented as an object of sacrifice becomes a source of dynastic legitimacy. Her suffering is transformed into ancestry. Her danger becomes origin. This sort of mythic repurposing was common in antiquity, where stories were expected to do several jobs at once: entertain, instruct, glorify, and explain. Andromeda's usefulness to genealogical imagination ensured that she would be remembered not only as the girl saved from a monster, but as the mother or ancestor of a future line, folded into the long human desire to find meaning in descent. Even so, ancient writers did not always agree on the details of where Andromeda lived or how her story should be localized. Some placed the events firmly in Ethiopia, while others, through translation and shifting geography, encouraged new identifications and associations. The word Ethiopia in Greek texts often referred more broadly to distant southern regions imagined as sunlit, maritime, and partially unknown, rather than the modern nation alone. This matters because the myth sits at the edge of Greek geographical imagination. Andromeda comes from a place that is at once specific and uncertain, familiar in the story but remote in the map. That remoteness adds a certain haze to the tale. The coast, the king, the punishment, the monster, all seem to emerge from a land that is near enough to be narrated, but far enough to remain wondrous. Ancient myth frequently used such distances to create a dreamlike register. The farther the setting, the more room there is for divine intervention and extraordinary danger. Andromeda's myth benefits from that soft geographic ambiguity. It allows her to be both local and universal, a princess in a particular royal house, and also a symbolic figure at the far reaches of the known world. That blend of specificity and haze gives the story its quiet, floating quality. Another subtle feature of Andromeda's reception is the way she sometimes appears in discussions of beauty, not merely as a decorative trait, but as a social force with consequences. Her mother Cassiopeia's boast about surpassing the sea nymphs in beauty is what sets the entire tragedy in motion, and so beauty in this myth is never harmless. It is admired, envied, displayed, and punished. Andromeda herself becomes the one who must pay for a contest of appearance that she did not create. That dynamic would have resonated in cultures where beauty, status, and divine attention were all connected, but also unstable. In the ancient world, to be beautiful could attract honor or danger, worship or resentment. The myth gently reminds us that admiration can turn sharp. A household may become proud of what others resent. A public claim may cool down a private cost. Andromeda stands in the middle of that tension, made vulnerable by a chain of events shaped by vanity and cosmic retribution. Her beauty is not described in excessive detail in the oldest surviving sources, which may be part of its power. It is assumed, almost atmospheric, and its consequences matter more than its features. The story seems to say that beauty, when placed in the wrong moral weather, can become the prelude to sorrow. At the same time, Andromeda's tale offers an unusual image of female endurance in Greek myth. She is not a warrior, a sorceress, or a queen making speeches. She is a young woman held in a suspended condition, and yet later readers often perceived strength in that very suspension. Endurance, after all, is not always loud. Sometimes it is the ability to remain present when one cannot change the situation. Sometimes it is the patience to wait for the unknown. In a mythic tradition that often celebrates bold acts, this quieter form of courage can be easy to miss. But Andromeda's immobility is not the same as absence. It concentrates attention. It turns the entire scene into an examination of helplessness under divine order. Her body, the chain, the cliff, and the approaching sea creature create a frame in which every detail matters. The story refuses to let the viewer look away too quickly. And if we listen to the older versions carefully, there is dignity in the simple fact that Andromeda is seen at all. She is not erased by the spectacle surrounding her. Instead, the myth holds her in place long enough for rescue, marriage, and memory to take root. The sea monster itself, while often treated as an episode-specific creature, also belongs to a broader mythic pattern in which waters represent uncertainty, danger, and cleansing force. In Andromeda's case, the creature embodies the pressure that rises when a community has offended a divine power. It is less a natural animal than a visible consequence. Ancient audiences were accustomed to interpreting extraordinary beasts in this symbolic way. The monster could stand for plague, upheaval, political disorder, or the raw terror of an ungovernable environment. It is telling that the threat arrives from the sea, which for Greeks could mean trade and travel, but also unpredictability and loss. Andromeda's survival, therefore, becomes more than a personal rescue. It is a temporary restoration of order against the sea's accusation. That restoration feels especially complete when Perseus triumphs, because the hero's arrival suggests that courage and timing can interrupt disaster. Yet even here the myth remains slightly sorrowful. The monster is defeated, but the memory of why it came cannot be undone. The sea retreats, but the human cause of the trouble lingers in the background. This gives the story a gentle depth, a sense that even victory carries the echo of prior imbalance. As the myth passed through Roman literature, Andromeda became increasingly available for rhetorical and philosophical reflection. Poets could use her image when speaking about constancy, beauty, rescue, or the power of divine favor. In some traditions, her scene served as a convenient emblem of dramatic suspense, a visual shorthand for innocence under threat. Roman readers who inherited Greek myth but reshaped it for their own literary habits often enjoyed elaborate description and emotional contrast. Andromeda's story provided both. There is the hard roughness of the rock and the sea spray, and there is the delicate promise of rescue. There is the public shame of being displayed as sacrifice and the private miracle of finding a future. Because of this, her image was adaptable. It could be used in grand poetry, elegant wall painting, and moral illustration. The myth became a kind of shared cultural furniture, familiar, dignified, and always ready to be reinterpreted. The fact that she was not a goddess but a mortal made her especially useful. Mortality allowed poets to heighten the pathos. Her human vulnerability made the contrast with divine or heroic intervention feel more intimate, more touching, and easier to remember in the calm after reading. And finally, one of the most enduring things about Andromeda is the way her myth preserves silence. So many Greek stories are full of speeches, proclamations, curses, and boasts. Andromeda's core image is quieter. She is the figure who waits. Even when later versions elaborate the details, there remains a still center in the tale where language seems to thin out. A chain does not speak, a cliff does not answer, the sea creature approaches without argument. The stars, once she is translated into the sky, continue that silence in another form. They shine without sound, holding the story in a kind of eternal hush. For sleep-friendly reflection, there may be something especially soothing in that. Not all myths are restless. Some are composed of pauses, distant light, and the soft unfolding of fate. Andromeda's story, in all its many versions, returns again and again to that patient, suspended moment. It is a story of danger, yes, but also of waiting, and of how waiting can become remembrance, and remembrance can become heaven.